But what led Pope Urban II then to finally declare the First Crusade? Were the reasons truly religious? You said people were honestly religious, or can we assume that, good old Urban had other, perhaps a bit more Game of Thrones sort of aims on his mind as well? Both can be true at the same time, right?
Yeah, this in many ways is is the classic question: why did Urban launch the crusade? And the problem is that he does tell us, but he gives different reasons. And when he launched the crusade at the Council of Clermont in July 1095, we have several versions of the sermon he gave launching the crusade, but the problem is those different versions give different reasons. Because different people attending his sermon wrote down different things.
He didn't write it himself.
He didn't write it himself, so we've only got what other people said about it. Some of them were present, and some of them heard his sermon from the reports of others, and we don't know. Are they reporting exactly what they said? Is he they're there with their pens writing it down as he's saying it, or are they giving their own version on what they think it's about? It's difficult to say.
But safe to assume that the ones who were there are a bit more legitimate than the ones that just heard it afterwards, right?
We hope so.
Okay. All right.
It's difficult to say. But there are various reasons that make a lot of sense when viewed from Urban's own agenda. So, factor one. I've mentioned already that back centuries before the Western Roman Empire fell to all those various peoples who crossed the Rhine frontier and then into the Western Roman Empire. But the Eastern Roman Empire, so that's what would be Greece, the Balkans, Anatolia, the Aegean Sea region, that survived as the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire survived for centuries until the 15th century. But directly before the First Crusade, the Byzantine Empire came under heavy attack because there was an enormous migration out of Central Asia by various Turkish peoples who advanced out of areas that today would be sort of Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, that sort of area, advancing south into Persia, Iraq, and then moving westwards into Syria, a massive movement of people. And they conquered much of the Islamic territory in the Middle East, but they also moved south into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, taking an enormous amount of territory. Now, that territory belonged to the Byzantine Empire at that time, and so the Byzantine Empire is losing land very, very rapidly, and there's a series of battlefield defeats as well. So the Byzantines are enormously worried, and they send a series of envoys back to Western Europe asking for help. And some nobles set out. 20 years before the First Crusade, Urban II's predecessor, Gregory VII, tried to launch a holy war to try and support Byzantium, but got very little support. And so there is this ongoing need in the eyes of the church to raise forces to protect Byzantium. That's one factor. Another factor is Jerusalem itself. There's been a growing trend of pilgrims going in large numbers to Jerusalem, and the Christians in Jerusalem themselves are in a very awkward position because on one hand, you have the advancing Turks moving in to Syria and then pushing south down towards Jerusalem. And then in Egypt, you have a Muslim empire called the Fatimid Empire. And Jerusalem, the area around it, becomes a frontier of war between the Seljuk Turks, the Seljuks being the leading Turkish dynasty in the northeast, and the Fatimids in the southwest, and Jerusalem is right on the front line. So there's a lot of persecution, a lot of suffering, a lot of fighting in the Jerusalem area. The persecution comes quite a bit before the First Crusade, but nonetheless, the Christians in Jerusalem are suffering a great deal because of the upheavals of conflict. And they begin to ask for help there too, and returning pilgrims report what the Christians in Jerusalem are suffering, and that news also gets back. So there's a lot of messengers coming either from Jerusalem or the Byzantine Empire asking for help. But Urban's got other problems as well. Urban knows that in southern France, and in other parts of Christendom, there's a huge amount of infighting. Knightly families fighting each other, petty lords fighting out their vendettas, and Urban himself knows this very well. He's the son of a French aristocratic family. So he's been raised as a child in this environment. He knows how violent it is. And it's his belief that Christians killing Christians in this way is utterly unacceptable in the eyes of God and has to stop. But the church's attempts to try and limit the violence in southern France particularly haven't been very successful. And so perhaps the crusade is a way of him taking all those fighting knights and sending them to go and do something else that he at least believes to be more acceptable in the eyes of God. And so, sorry for your patience, there's even more here. Urban's also got even bigger problems, or additional problems. He is facing an anti-pope, so a rival pope, who has been raised by the German emperor, Emperor Henry IV, and Henry IV wants this rival pope to become pope. And so Urban is fighting for his own position. And so the crusade wasn't directed against the German emperor or against his rival pope, but it might be a way for him to assert his authority as the main religious authority in Western Christendom. Now, where exactly which within those factors is the most important, exactly which Urban considered to be the most central idea for launching the crusade, we don't entirely know, but these seem to be the factors in orbit around his thinking when he came to launch the crusade.
If I'm not mistaken, on top of everything else that you've just outlined, there's the Great Schism, the big split between the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Happened when, like 50 years before the events we're discussing right now?
Yeah, so what's called, the Great Schism is often linked to an event where a papal legate, so that's a church representative from the Catholic Church, and the Orthodox Patriarch in Constantinople, the main religious authority of the Byzantine Empire, when they mutually excommunicated each other. But in fact, that was fairly short-lived. The relationship wasn't broken at that point, although it was a major issue. But there is growing friction, there's a growing separation between the Catholic Church centered in Rome and what will become the Orthodox Church centered in Constantinople, the center of the Orthodox Church of the Byzantine Empire. And the relationship is strained. So yes, certainly if Urban were to send troops to support the Byzantine Empire, that might go some way to healing the emerging rift between them. So yes, that could be a sort of a linked-in motive connected to supporting the Byzantine Empire against the advancing Turkish forces.
I see. So the separation was not complete at that time yet. Because I was like, okay, these guys are clearly not BFFs anymore. And yet the West, is responding with the crusade. But by the way, what's the role of the Byzantium king Alexius I? What's his role in all this?
So yeah, he's calling for help.
Okay.
He calls for help repeatedly before the crusade. And in fact, a few months before Urban launches the crusade himself, at an earlier church council in Piacenza in northern Italy, Alexius's representatives arrive and specifically ask the Pope for military assistance. So this is a very live issue for the papacy at this time. But again, there's a range of factors. What exactly Urban was thinking, we don't entirely know.
Okay. All right. So when the Pope's proclamation about the Crusades reaches various courts, as well as, I don't know, town markets, peasant villages, whatever, what's the response like? Is everybody unanimously enthusiastic about this idea? Or are there people who are not so keen?
It's an incredible response because at this time, Western Christendom, Western Europe, it's not that big. Its population is probably only in the tens of millions. And yet it's estimated that there may be as many as maybe 200,000 people who went on the First Crusade. Now, if modern-day population of Europe, I think, is something over 300 million. But proportionately, if that number of people went today, we would definitely notice. that would be a mass movement. So a large number of people went. There may have been critics, and there are certainly people who criticized the hysteria that emerged around the launch of the Crusade. And the first Crusaders, as they began to marshal their armies, in many cases, those gathering armies also persecuted many Jewish communities in Western Europe, which is another exceptionally violent and tragic moment of the Crusade. And there, too, there is criticism of that. The church doesn't want the Jewish communities to be persecuted. The church places Jewish communities under its protection. So there is criticism of the Crusade, but the basic idea that Christians can wage holy war, there is surprisingly little concern raised about that at the time, at least in the surviving sources. But here we may be a little bit in the area of seeing history in hindsight, because most of the sources describing the First Crusade were written after the Crusade, in fact, virtually all. And so they all knew the Crusade did manage to march thousands of miles through Eastern Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and the Middle East, and it did conquer Jerusalem. And to their mind, the fact that it was so successful, when from a military perspective, it really shouldn't have been successful. I mean, it's an incredibly ambitious undertaking. It shouldn't have succeeded, but it did from a military perspective. And for many people, that is incontestable proof that God did want this to happen. And so that will probably have played a role in silencing criticism, because people could just say in response, well, if God didn't want this to happen, why was the Crusade able to conquer Jerusalem?
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I've been told on countless YouTube tutorials that I have to say this, otherwise nothing happens, which is strange. Also, if you feel like it, support me on Patreon. I'm playing the world's smallest violin here, but this is a one-person pod. I have no production team, no nothing. So feel free to hop on Patreon and find smart cookies on there. And then last but certainly not least, I have to thank my existing patrons, Tovarishin, Tovarishice. Without you, this podcast simply would not exist. So thank you so much. That makes you actual producers of this show. So eternal thanks to Darej, Rok Tržan, Sasha Vipotnik, Neven Cvijanović, Juž Premrov, Nate Sirk, Goran Ivašić, Anže Sever, Ole, Marin Ferrara, Dejan Žolnir, Aljaš Maher, Štrole, Aida Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Goran, Gordon, Lorenzo, Jure Čuk, Mila, Carmen, Veronica, and Tai Chi. You guys rock. Thank you so much.